In Little Nightmares, you awaken to a world you know very little about. It has this slick, dark fairy tale aesthetic with a Roald Dahl and Tim Burton twist, and you are thrust into the role of Six, a diminutive girl who has seemingly been living in squalor in a makeshift suitcase. No exposition, context, or purpose beyond your immediate situation is presented to you, and off you go. You uncover a horrifying world filled with cannibalistic gluttons, child harvesters, and vain egomaniacal overseers, and what little sense you make of this universe is doled out sparingly. The game is extremely short, has next to no dialogue, is vague to its purpose, and doesn't provide clear resolution to the player. You would think this is a recipe for a game that would be universally reviled, except the reality is quite the opposite. It has inspired countless theories, videos, opinions, and impressions, and grabs our attention in ways that more explicit narratives completely fail to do. This is because Little Nightmares and games like it harness some intriguing facts about our psychology, as well as the language of ambiguity done best in our medium. This is what I'm calling the clarity of ambiguity, a powerful way to engage players by doing less, not more. This type of game first rose to prominence with Playdead's game Limbo. It too is a 2D side-scroller featuring a diminutive child who has to navigate a harsh, mysterious world. It used a film noir aesthetic and more conventional archetypical fears like spiders, tribal men, and government control. Countless theories have been spawned in videos and forums attempting to explain the plot and what exactly it all means, but the developers are hardly forthcoming. One theory says it is a metaphor for Limbo, where you repeat cycles endlessly in a Sisyphean loop of futility, just like the games we play. Others say the boy is on a quest to escape Limbo, is dead and has to find peace to ascend to heaven, died falling out of a treehouse, a car crash, and some mention the symbolic relevance of control and repressed primal fears as a metaphor for the post-industrial human condition. Again, there is no canonical interpretation to the game. All these are plausible, but none are explicitly true. Why is this so endlessly fascinating though? Let's start with a quick experiment. What do you see here? In a literal sense, there are shapes frolicking about, but can you help but see a narrative weaved into this? The researchers Hyder and Simmel found that most interpret this scene with narrative gusto, seeing a predatory large shape accosting a couple of innocents, who eventually thwart him. Unless you are autistic, you are very likely to have interpreted it in a similar way, and the researchers' findings confirm that. This is called apophenia by some, but is essentially our pattern recognition instinct. Our minds are wired to read stories into even the most ambiguous phenomena, because evolutionarily, seeing agency where it might not be is of great utility. You may interpret the rustling of leaves as a tiger, but on the off chance that it is, your jumpy disposition would allow you to pass on your genes. We are hardwired to see agency even in inanimate objects, something called a hyperagency detection module, and some argue this explains our propensity for myth, religion, storytelling, and culture. So we see how we don't really need explicit cues to read stories into things, which explains how we read so much when given so little. Dark Souls is a game that has similar narrative structure, where it gives you a loose overarching plot, being the chosen undead, but very little outside this traditional conceit is conveyed to you. As you search through items, the environment, and enemies, the full story reveals itself to you, and you find out that you are doing the gods' bidding to prolong their age of fire at the expense of the age of man. The game uses the ambiguity of its structure and narrative to provide a richer tapestry than would be possible in a conventional form, as it is up to the player to uncover all this. You could go through the entire game and think you fulfilled some heroic quest, but you realize, if you explore further, the tangled set of puppet strings that are pulling you along. Little Nightmares, Limbo, and Playdead's newest game Inside all share this idea of challenging agency and control in a universe that evades our comprehension. Limbo has these sections where people's minds are controlled by bugs, a potential metaphor for being controlled by society. In Inside, you go through the game to seemingly rescue people being harvested to fuel some hive mind, only to realize that it was planned all along, as there are schematics outlining your entire route. In Little Nightmares, you turn into the soul-sucking woman looking to harness people's life for her vanity, and use this ability to escape the maw itself. Inside has this secret area at the beginning, where if you pull out this plug, Your character turns into this unanimated husk, jumping out of the screen and possibly pointing at you for your participation in this charade. We are controlling these avatars through these dreary worlds for our entertainment, and these are perhaps metaphors for gaming itself. Limbo, Little Nightmares, Dark Souls, and Inside share a lineage with an older game, one that was actually in 3D. Eco tells the story of a diminutive child stuck in a castle, persecuted for being born with demonic horns. The children lost in the woods or forbidden castle motif has been powerful since stories like Hansel and Gretel or Jack and the Beanstalk, and the idea of being transported to another realm is a powerful conceit in stories like Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, and The Wizard of Oz. It's an archetypical fairy tale of a child coming to grips with a scary, unforgiving world that doesn't care about their place in it. Viktor Shklovsky once said that art was about defamiliarization, about shocking our system with something so unprecedented that we are forced to stand up and take notice. Eco is both eerily familiar but also utterly foreign, and like Little Nightmares, revolves around confronting an evil female figure who is using us and others to feed her own ambitions. By placing us in these bizarre, ambiguous worlds, the developers of these games are forcing us to pay attention.
I love Sok Hinogoshi Konjoshi Ujushika Inensei.
The researcher Irving Beedelman argues that we are what he calls infovores, a species who craves information when the world around us is not forthcoming with stimuli. He found that there are opioid receptors in the parts of the brain that mediate comprehension and interpretation, suggesting there is genuine neurochemical pleasure associated with processing information. When we're safe and in an environment with an information deficit, our minds literally rush with endorphins at the thought of uncovering a truth, and the worlds these developers devise perfectly leverage these predispositions. Our system is designed to pick out the novel and unfamiliar, and explain it with theories to satisfy our lust for information, placating our angst about why we might be here. I hardly think it is a coincidence that all these games are about subversive, insidious control and evil, and are eager to involve the player in this act.
48 hours of this.
Okay, Mickey, so...
On an episode of the popular science series Horizon, researchers wanted to see the effects complete sensory deprivation would have on volunteers. The participants were housed in dark rooms for 48 hours, and microphones and cameras recorded their every action. Some participants started to hallucinate patterns, others assumed phenomena that never really happened, and they all were miserable for the entire duration of the experiment. Interestingly, after the study, frontal cortex-mediated abilities like memory recall, information processing, and resistance to suggestibility all showed a marked decrease. So not only does sensory deprivation make us conjure up phantasms, it makes us susceptible to outside influence. Horror stories across different media all leverage this phenomena, desaturating their worlds, creating grainy filters, and generally depriving the player of too much stimuli. And this powerful tool is used in games for the same purposes. Another BBC study had a journalist attempt to reenact a torture method used by the CIA called blackout boxes, where suspected terrorists would be shoved inside a little container with very little room to maneuver. My mind jumped to how Six in Little Nightmares lives in a suitcase, Eco's protagonist is trapped in a confined cell, and we start imprisoned as the chosen undead in Dark Souls. Another interesting point about this is that the torturers start playing the screams of children to further debilitate victims, as apparently we have an evolutionary impulse to respond to the cries of infants. It's interesting, right? How Limbo, Little Nightmares, Eco, Inside, and games like it all feature children for their protagonists, perhaps a deliberate move to heighten our distress and suggestibility. Games are starting to understand the power of ambiguity in crafting stories, and some, like Thomas Was Alone, deliberately use this ambiguity to tell explicit exposition. A shape is just a shape, but like in The Experiment, put it next to a short stumpy shape and that one seems insecure. But why do we interpret these games the way we do? Like I said, there is a built-in tendency towards paranoia in our DNA, and this is why uncertainty being coupled with stories about subversion, control, and disempowerment are so potent. There is also something called ontological closure, or the need for answers, and just world theory. We are seeking to find a coherent, morally plausible explanation for the happenings around us, which is why an onslaught of opinions surround these games. A writer who used and popularized this idea was H.P. Lovecraft, who famously said, "Of all fears, fear of the unknown is the worst." To quote him more directly, he said, "The most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. One day, the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will unleash such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we will either be driven mad from the revelation or flee from the light into the peace and safety of a new dark age." Lovecraftian themes require information be withheld from the player, otherwise it loses its potency. The game Bloodborne did this more explicitly, replicating the motifs of uncertainty, knowledge, and madness in its central fiction. Inside the game, scholars go mad at the discovery of new truths they perhaps shouldn't have investigated too diligently. To parallel this, insight is granted to players as a mechanical conceit every time they meet a new boss or see something novel. This takes a fascinating meta-dimension, as the Soulsborne lore community is as obsessive as the scholars within the game are when it comes to uncovering the truths embedded in its universe. If you imply there are clandestine truths waiting to be uncovered, players apparently stop at nothing to piece it together with alarmingly enthusiastic obsessiveness. We are insatiably curious for evolutionary reasons, but our curiosity often leads us to perilous discoveries about the nature of reality. These games use the wide-eyed wonder of youth as an exploratory vehicle, both to emphasize disempowerment but also show how little we know. They give us a playground to explore sinister, macabre, information-sparse, and highly novel fantasy worlds, to come to grips with predilections and insecurities that have plagued our species from the start. Your contribution to the Limbo Forum is a part of this collaborative endeavor. For people looking to design games like this, there are some key components you should be striving to replicate. These games are in dark fantasy worlds that are eerily familiar but utterly foreign. There is practically no direct exposition. Instead, everything is told through environmental storytelling. They seem to occupy dreamlike worlds, whether it's Limbo, an isolated castle, or a desolate ship. These are very reminiscent of places like Neverland in Peter Pan, Pleasure Island in Pinocchio, and the never-ending story's hazy, fantastical world. They also rely on diegetic noise, or noise that is internal to the game's world, and are comfortable with silence. Eco was one of the first that employed this, being copied by the likes of Dark Souls to amplify tension and dread. John Cage in his piece 433 famously showed how silence is its own music, and these games took that lesson to heart. In his GDC talk entitled The Play of Stillness, Brian Upton argues that most of what constitutes a game takes place in a player's head, and this powerful device is often ignored by designers. He cites PT as a prime example of what he calls interpretive play, where the interactivity comes not from traditional mechanics, but noticing minor discrepancies in environmental cues to piece together what the hell is going on. Again, the sensory-sparse environment and similarity of each round through the corridor only heightens the player's receptivity to the slightest changes, enhancing its inscrutable allure. Another talk, entitled Creating Atmosphere in Games by the developer of Bastion, Greg Kasavin, suggests the key to creating atmospheric worlds is to have a tonal and thematic consistency through your game to heighten a player's immersion. This extends to your user interface, music, voiceover, art, and story.
And it's part of a, it's registering together. It's not pulling you in too many different directions. The next thing is that atmospheric games generally provide a seamless experience for the player, both in the presentation and by having a consistent sense of internal logic. Now, the idea of internal logic, it might kind of bring to mind the idea of realism, but it has nothing at all to do with that. We can suspend our disbelief around just about anything. Like, think of a game like Braid, which I'll come back to in a bit. That game isn't realistic at all, but the internal logic is extremely strong. You start to understand the rules of that world.
Bastion's narrator is a good example of this, which might have seemed intrusive and incoherent, if not for the exceptional writing and voice acting. Anything that does not make sense within the logic of your world will only destroy the suspension of disbelief, what Tolkien called enchantment. Another talk by the creator of Soma, called Creating Existential Dread, suggests that to generate what he calls presence in a story, You need constant input by the player that has predictable outcomes for them to navigate in the world. This means that grounding everything in the fiction of the world is really important, something puzzle designers in particular struggle deeply with. What games like Limbo and Little Nightmares do exceptionally well is tie the puzzle-solving elements into the thematic, narrative, and moral framework of their story, unifying it under a central tone and leveraging player agency to fill in the gaps. Think of how the puzzles in Eco feel organically enmeshed in the castle environment, but still reinforce the core themes of companionship as they require cooperation to be solved. Or that sequence in Inside where you have to pretend to be brainwashed like everyone else around you to pass the guards. This sequence is a puzzle embedded in the themes of the universe, making it much more believable. One final thing he also mentions is embedding moral decisions in the world itself if you want to impact players more powerfully. He cites Spec Ops The Line's non-binary morality system as inspiration, and this is now starting to creep into a lot of games. Instead of giving players a clear delineation between good and evil, let them wallow in the paralysis that accompanies indecision, and your thematic beats will sear themselves into their minds forever.
Which he did. Killing the man's family.
Designing a richly interpretable world doesn't mean you just throw things out there. You have to purposefully ensure many theories can be weaved into the narrative simultaneously. The multiplicity of theories for insight, including it being a metaphor for cancer or gaming or birth, are all plausible interpretations of the sequence of symbols used, and this needs to be crafted deliberately. In a world of games with power fantasies and an eagerness to serve the player, these games all put you in a disempowering role, and feature worlds that don't really care about you, seem to exist independent of you, and are utterly inscrutable. The range of defamiliarizing aesthetics from film noir to silent film to Tim Burton to quasi-anime are all unsettling in their own way, but also very familiar. Despite featuring children, they all deal with some of the deepest themes known to humans, including agency, existentialism, control, evil, fate, destiny, life, death, suffering, madness, and fear. The power of an interactive medium is it can put us into the role of different characters and force us to undergo what they do. These games tap into that primal need for explanation, control, and order, and reveal how that curiosity leads us to finding out things that we might have been better off not knowing. Since it is a game, however, it is ultimately safe, so it provides us a relatively benign context to explore these themes and indulge our need for symbol hunting and explanation. These are childhood dark fantasies come to life in a new medium, and I would argue are much more powerful for their interactivity. Thank you for watching. If you have more thoughts on the subject of ambiguity in games, leave them in the comments. And if you want more content like this, please be sure to subscribe. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.